The global financial system broke while you were asleep. Here's the contradiction. Markets opened like nothing happened. Screens stayed calm. Prices still moved. But behind those numbers, a switch had already been flipped, and it directly affects you, whether you own stocks, hold cash, or think this is just about metals. In the first hours after a new administration took power, an executive order quietly changed how one asset is treated by the state. On paper, it looked technical, procedural, almost boring, but in practice it did something far bigger. It removed a safety valve the system has relied on for decades. Notice what didn't happen. There was no emergency press conference, no market-wide halt, no warning banner on your trading app. Just business as usual, while something foundational stopped working in the background. And here's why that matters to you. Modern markets don't fail all at once. They fracture. First, one mechanism breaks, then another has to compensate. Then the pressure jumps somewhere else. This is where the story flips, because the first crack didn't appear where people were looking. It appeared where delivery, not price, suddenly mattered again. What happened next wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a framing shift. And that's what most people missed. The core move wasn't about markets collapsing. It was about redefining what counts. An executive action reclassified a material the system had treated as abstract for decades and pulled it back into the realm of strategy and security. On the surface, it looked like a narrow policy decision, but placed in context, it fits a much larger pattern that's been building quietly for years. Here's the pattern. When systems become too leveraged to control directly, power stops trying to manage prices and starts managing access. Not what something is worth, but who gets it and who doesn't. That's a very different game. Now ask yourself this. If the problem were volatility, why not calm markets? If the goal were stability, why introduce friction? And if this were just symbolic, why change the rules around delivery instead of trading? Notice what's being framed as normal. The idea that markets can keep quoting numbers even if the underlying promise behind those numbers no longer functions the same way. This wasn't about panic, it was about positioning. And once you see that, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who was exposed the moment the rules changed? Here's the claim that changes how you read everything that followed. A small group of institutions wasn't positioned for volatility. They were positioned for control. And the moment delivery rules tightened, that control snapped. For years, a handful of major banks held massive short positions tied to silver. Not dozens of contracts, hundreds of millions of ounces, positions so large they only worked under one assumption, that most contracts would never require physical delivery. That assumption was the system. Then the math surfaced. Registered inventories sat in the tens of millions of ounces, while paper claims stacked up at more than 10 times that amount. On screen, prices looked contained. Off screen, obligations were quietly outgrowing reality. Here's the key detail. The new rules didn't need prices to rise to cause damage. They only needed one thing to change, the ability to roll, delay, or cash settle instead of delivering metal. Notice what's missing from the public response. No clear denial of exposure, no transparent inventory reconciliation, no reassurance that delivery could be met if demanded at scale. That silence matters, because once price and delivery stop meaning the same thing, losses stop being linear. They turn exponential. A small move forces margin calls. Margin calls force liquidations. Liquidations expose what was never there to begin with. And this is where the pressure accelerates. From there, the situation didn't explode. It normalized. And that's the dangerous part. Instead of an immediate shock, the system absorbed the change by stretching. Trading continued, screens stayed live, but the behavior underneath started to look strange. Liquidity thinned, spreads widened, requests took longer to process. Things that used to be automatic suddenly required review. This isn't new in history. When pressure builds inside a system that can't admit failure, the first response is always delay. Not denial, delay. Push the problem forward one more day, one more settlement cycle, one more workaround. But here's what should stand out. What was once considered unthinkable began to sound routine. Modified delivery procedures, alternative settlements, temporary adjustments, language designed to make an abnormal condition feel administrative. This is how instability becomes invisible. Notice how fast expectations shifted. The question quietly changed from, can this be delivered, to how will this be settled? That's not a technical difference. That's a line being crossed, because once delivery becomes optional in practice, trust becomes optional too. And when trust turns optional, the system doesn't break immediately. It starts shedding weight. And the next layer of pressure doesn't come from prices at all. It comes from credibility. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Publicly, institutions kept insisting the market was functioning. Privately, behavior shifted fast. Physical obligations were quietly reinterpreted. Commitments that once meant metal began to mean cash. And the gap between what was promised and what could be delivered widened in real time. Here's the stronger evidence. When delivery pressure increased, the response wasn't confidence. It was exemption. Clauses were activated. Settlement terms were revised. What had been sold as certainty was suddenly treated as conditional. Watch the mismatch. On one side, statements about stability. On the other, actions that only make sense if delivery is a problem. You don't change the rules of fulfillment unless fulfillment is at risk. This is the detail that permanently changes how you see the issue. The system didn't fail because prices moved too fast. It faltered because too many claims pointed to the same limited pool of reality. Notice what still isn't happening. No institution stepping forward to say, clearly, we can meet all physical obligations. No transparent audit, volunteered, just procedural language and time-buying measures. That tells you everything, because once words and actions diverge, markets stop being about valuation. They become about exit speed. And at that point, the stress doesn't concentrate. It spreads. Then the pressure stopped moving in a straight line. It started stocking. First, delivery timelines stretched. What used to clear in days slipped into weeks. Then came the secondary effects. Margin requirements tightened. Credit terms quietly changed. Counterparties started asking different questions, not about price, but about guarantees. Second, activity began to cluster. The same names kept appearing on both sides of multiple transactions. That's a signal of stress. When markets are healthy, risk disperses. When they aren't, it concentrates. Third, liquidity didn't vanish. It rerouted. Trading still happened, but through fewer channels, with fewer participants willing to commit size. That's not a freeze, it's a choke. Notice how fast the tempo changed. What had taken years to build started shifting in days. Each adjustment forced another. Each workaround created a new point of failure. This is what loss of control looks like. Not chaos, compression. And once systems enter this phase, they don't de-escalate on their own. So the real question isn't whether this is serious. It's simple. What happens if this continues? Now shift perspective. Forget institutions. Forget balance sheets. Look at where this lands on you. If you rely on prices to mean availability, this matters. If you assume savings can always be converted when needed, this matters. If you've ever believed that liquidity is the same as access, this matters. Because when delivery becomes conditional, everyday decisions change. Companies delay production, suppliers demand prepayment, contracts that once felt solid suddenly carry escape clauses. None of this shows up as a crash, it shows up as friction. Slower timelines, higher buffers, more cash locked up doing nothing. You feel it when costs rise without explanation, when wait times stretch, when choices narrow, not because demand exploded overnight, but because confidence quietly retreated. This is how systemic stress reaches ordinary life, not through headlines, but through constraints. You're offered alternatives instead of fulfillment, substitutions instead of certainty. And notice how familiar that feels. If this sounds like something you've already experienced in other parts of the economy, say so in the comments, because what's happening here isn't isolated. It's part of a broader shift in how systems behave under pressure. And the mechanism behind it is the real story. What allows this to happen isn't corruption or incompetence. It's incentive structure. Modern financial systems are designed to optimize appearances, not resilience. As long as numbers move smoothly and obligations can be deferred, stress stays hidden. The system rewards delay, opacity, and complexity because they buy time, and time is leverage. Here's the unsettling part. No single actor has to break the rules. Everyone can stay technically compliant while the outcome drifts further from reality. Contracts roll, definitions soften, risk migrates instead of disappearing. That's why spectacle matters. As long as attention stays on prices, debates, and personalities, the underlying mechanics escape scrutiny. Delivery rules change quietly. Settlement assumptions shift silently. And by the time anyone notices, the behavior has already normalized. This is why mainstream coverage always arrives late. It reports events, not mechanisms. It shows symptoms after the process is complete. The system isn't built to tell you when confidence leaves. It's built to function until it can't. And once confidence becomes optional, stability becomes performative, which leads to the next question. If the mechanism is already in motion, where does it actually go from here? From here, the path splits. Not cleanly, not evenly, but decisively. One direction looks calm on the surface. Markets adapt, rules are clarified, new settlement standards emerge, prices stabilize enough to restore routine. In this version, the system absorbs the shock by shrinking quietly. Fewer participants, more collateral, less leverage. It survives, but in a tighter, more controlled form. The other direction is less orderly. Pressure keeps migrating faster than rules can follow. Each adjustment exposes another dependency. Each attempt to contain risk shifts it somewhere else. Confidence doesn't vanish all at once. It fragments, different prices, different access, different rules for different players. Notice the common thread. In both paths, the old assumptions don't fully return. The idea that markets are frictionless, that delivery is implicit, that liquidity is universal. Those beliefs don't survive contact with this moment. And the decision point isn't public. It's happening quietly in how contracts are written, how guarantees are demanded, and how much trust participants are willing to extend. The next move isn't announced, it's already forming. Here's the insight that ties everything together. This was never just about one asset or one market. It was about a system built on the assumption that promises could always be extended faster than they needed to be honored. The moment delivery started to matter more than pricing, that assumption cracked. When you look back, this won't register as a single day or a single decision. It will look like a transition from abstraction to constraint, from smooth numbers to hard limits. That shift doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself over time through behavior, not headlines. And that's why this story isn't finished. What happens next won't be decided by what's said publicly, but by which promises are quietly redefined behind the scenes. If you want to understand how that process unfolds and what it signals before it becomes obvious, follow and subscribe. This is The Layer Beneath the News.